Jump back into GDP, because that's about all I know about John DeLorean. We'll see, does GDP actually measure what we want it to measure? We talked about it's like the total production in an economy, and it measures our output and our material standard of living. But how accurate is it? And how well does it show human well-being? Because obviously there's more to life than just the things you have. So while it's useful, it's a really good tool for policymakers to understand the health of the economy in general, what does it actually mean for people? Does it actually help people? Okay, so there's two types of production that aren't counted in GDP. The first is household production. Household production is, things like childcare, cleaning, cooking, anything that's done in the home that isn't being paid for from other people. I do dishes almost every night. Well, okay, like every third night. But like in theory, doing this every night, I'm never compensated for this time I spend every day doing work. So it's not counted in GDP. But it's definitely labor that's being performed. And these contributions are real. So if I wanted it done and I didn't have the time, I'd have to pay someone else to do it. And then it would count in GDP as a service being rendered. But because it's being done in the home, being done for free, it's not being counted. Likewise, there's the underground economy, or the black market. So buying and selling goods outside of legal government-enforced markets, being concealed by the government, those are illegal. Again, done because of regulations, because goods and services are illegal, to avoid taxes. And there's also, I think it counts under black market instead of household production. But if you go and do chores for like your grandmother and she gives you 20 bucks, that's not being counted in GDP. Even though there's money being exchanged, it's not being filed on tax returns, at least hopefully. Yeah, so it's missing out on, kids mowing their neighbor's lawn, trimming their grandparents' hedges, putting up their Christmas tree while their grandparents fight about how old the star is that goes on top. That might be a little specific. That might just be my experience. But now in some countries, black market is huge. In the US, they estimate it's about 10% of the economy. In other countries, it's as high as 50% of the economy. And it's not just stuff like drugs or prostitution or gambling, like these illegal things you think about. It's also in like normal products. So the things that would be legal businesses in the United States that are just operating without the required license. So for instance, like a hairdresser has to have a license in the United States. They could operate in the black market by just not having a license and they don't report their income or anything. In other countries, it can be extremely onerous to get a license. You may have to bribe several different officials if you live in a corrupt country. So they would operate oftentimes without that license in the black market. Even though the good's not illegal or bad or harmful, they're just not doing it with the government's blessing. So how important are these shortcomings? Some people say they're extremely important. So Oscar Morgenstern, he invented the idea of game theory with John von Neumann. And he was extremely, extremely critical of gross domestic product and its predecessor, gross national product, which we'll talk about at the very end. He quoted Albert Einstein in a thing he wrote, basically just talking smack on GDP. Einstein said, "Most scientists naively think they know what they observe and how they should measure it." And he was talking about like hard science. He wasn't even talking about social scientists like economists. But if you think like physicists are overconfident in themselves and naive to the problems they face, social scientists are 1,000 times worse. So measurement, or in this case, estimation, is difficult to do so accurately. But we're treating these numbers, people tend to treat the GDP number as perfectly accurate. just counting like the whole, like all the quantity that's being produced or the quantity being sold is difficult enough and difficult to do accurately. But we're attaching welfare values to the quantity that's being produced. Now we do that through market prices, which is a pretty good way to do it, but there's still difficulties arising from using these market values. Because it doesn't account for human subjective value. So remember we talked about consumer surplus before, where consumers value goods more than the market value? So we're missing out on some of this value. We're missing out on all the consumer surplus in the economy, which would show like people's needs are being met. These goods are being valued even more by consumers than GDP would say. So it assumes basically that the price is the true value, which we know is wrong. There's subjective value. Each individual has different needs and different wants and places different value on these goods. The market price is the easiest and the most obvious way to do it, but there's still this problem of having a different value for each person. Also noted that GDP is a singular scalar, so it's not like a vector value. There's no direction towards it. You asked the question, would we ever use a scalar, one simple number, to measure growth in the human body? A lot of healthcare people in here. How would we do that? Number of cells? Measure height, and then you're not getting weight. And it says nothing about the health of the human body. So you're not even looking at the amount of muscle compared to fat. I don't know, the strength, the brittleness of bones, amount of hair. There's tons of different things. If you're trying to assess the overall health and well-being of the human body, that you're missing out just by trying to use one metric. And that's the problem we see with GDP. It's just one metric, trying to take into account everything. It also doesn't tell us what's being made and what's being sold. So bombs and bread count for exactly the same. But bombs don't make people better off. I guess you say in a war, it makes people better off because it defends their lives in that nation, theoretically. But you can't eat them. In order to survive, people need bread. And it doesn't count the things that doesn't separate things that people like, nice little luxuries, compared to things they actually need. So it doesn't tell you if people's absolute barest needs are being met. It just says that something is being produced. In the Soviet Union, they used to have quotas that each factory would have to put out. So there's the story of the nail factory that was running behind on their quota. They didn't have enough time, but their output was measured in pounds, not pounds, probably kilograms. Right, because I think they were a metric system by then. So what they did is they just made one giant nail to account for their shortfall. It could never be used by anyone. It provided no value, but it technically was produced. So it counts for GDP. So it doesn't take into account the usefulness of what we're producing. And returning to the biology example, for that no concept of whether it meets human needs or not, would we consider the growth of cancer cells in person actual growth? Technically it is, but it's a bad thing. So if something bad increases GDP, we're going to keep counting that like it's something good. And finally, there's no error bars ever. So they say GDP is this certain number. They say 20 trillion and all those digits all the way through. We never say it could be plus or minus this much. When you see the polls, usually it's just political polls, but any of the polls will usually say plus or minus 3%. But there's a margin of error because they're taking hopefully a random sample of the population, but may not perfectly account for the population. So there's always going to be some leeway on each side of this estimate of what the true value is going to be. We never see that. Simon Kuznets, another great economist, said that estimated that GDP back in the 50s or 60s could be off by as much as 20%. That's a huge margin of error. So despite all these shortcomings, it still probably the best single measure we have, but it's important to note that it's not the end-all be-all. It's not going to tell you everything that's going on in the economy. You guys probably don't care about me ranting about this, but it's important for a lot of economists to remember this. That we kind of overstate the importance of GDP, because that's what we can measure. Economists are a lot like the joke about the drunk man who lost his car keys. This guy comes out of the bar, he sees a really drunk man looking for his car keys under a streetlight. The guy asks him what he's doing. He's like, yeah, I'm looking for my car keys. He goes, oh, where'd you drop them? He said, over there, but there's no light, so it's easier to look over here. Basically what we're doing with the data, where we do have something to compare, we look at that area, even if it's not trying to meet exactly what we're looking for. So while it doesn't do a great job of capturing human well-being, it does a good enough job. And because human well-being and happiness is so subjective, not just over time, but between cultures, and you need like personal surveys asking people about how happy they are, how well their needs are being met, and all their needs are different. Looking at this material production is the best we got. Now the two areas we were talking about, the black market and household production, if they're the same year to year, if we're missing that same percentage, then we can use percent change in GDP to reasonably measure the change in production over time. We're still missing that same part every time, but because it's not really changing, we can at least get like the core growth of what we can measure. And then over time, it'll be accurate. So we can measure changes even if the total amount isn't accurate. But over long periods of time, we can have these things differ. So for example, back in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, women entered the labor force in really large numbers. The labor force participation rate and their total employment drastically increased. So some household production that was being done traditionally by women was being replaced by paid childcare and restaurant meals. So a lot of increase, or portion of the increase in GDP at this time would have just been accounted from women now entering the workforce, and instead of doing this work in household for free, it's now being paid for. Someone else is being paid for. So now it's being counted where it wasn't being counted before. Oh yeah, sorry.
How do they keep track of how much of everything is produced? Because I know, like, I work at Arby's and just like thinking about like how many sandwiches we make, but then like how many we waste from dropping a bun on the floor, and like I don't know how you would count that.
I guess it's just the final sales, but that's. I wonder how that would be counted.
Because I've never counted how many sandwiches I've made first.
That's an intermediate little thing. It was produced. That bun was produced.
That's also what I was
Then you
thinking.
dropped it on the floor and threw it out, so it was never sold to consumers. So does that bun count as a final good? Because you were the last user?
I know we're supposed to keep track of waste, but I never do that either.
Estimation.
I mean, basing off the same thing, at my job, when we make sandwiches and stuff, if they're not sold by a certain time, we just take them back out and write them off and throw them away. So then what? If they're in our system as write-offs, but they're still thrown away, so they were never given out.
Yeah, if they're in the system, then they would be counted somehow.
But if she's not writing it off, then hers are not counted for at all.
Yeah, I don't know the nitty-gritty about how the Bureau of Economic
Also,
Analysis
what if
actually does that.
Yeah, what if somebody asks for like extra tomatoes? Like you don't count that.
You would still sell the same number of tomatoes. You would have to buy additional tomatoes. So there are purchases coming out somewhere. Just wait till we talk about how you count the inflation rate. My dad still doesn't believe me about that. Well, that does remind me, you guys are talking, when my dad was in college, he didn't have money for a meal plan, but one of his friends worked at KFC. So at the end of the night, they had to throw out all the stale chicken. So his friend would just put put in like a special like grocery bag and then tie that up and set it up next to the dumpster, and they'd send a plunger over to get that for them. Or they'd eat stale-ish fried chicken every night, but it was free. But was it counted in GDP? Actually, don't know. I'll dig on the VEA website after class and see if I can find something on that.
Well, then is that the same thing as like when you're making a car and you talked about like the tires and you count like the car as a whole, not the tires? Like, would it just be the sandwich as a whole?
But that bun was still being produced and purchased by someone before you threw it out. Like, it's definitely gonna be registered somewhere as a purchase. I don't know if it'll just be like a line item on like the whole company's like thing, like, okay, we threw out this much estimated. Yeah, this nitty gritty is what makes GDP just an estimate and not like an actual like calculation, not a real number. Oh yeah, and this is just saying that many countries, the informal sector is up to like 50% of total output. One of the bad things about firms having to operate in the black market is that it holds back growth. These firms tend to be smaller and have less capital, so we're seeing less productivity growth over time. So there are a lot of good reasons why firms in countries with really bad governance would want to operate in the black market. So maybe the government anytime could step in and seize their assets, seize their profits or the actual business itself. Maybe they're forced to pay bribes to officials to operate legally, so they just save a lot of money and operate illegally. This is a few years old, but according to the UN, out of the 177 countries that they recognize, 77% of them were rated as less than stable. So through the world, there's a lot of poor governance going on. All right, and there's some other stuff that GDP doesn't take into account. Usually we use GDP per capita to represent standards of living, the differences between one country and another, or for one country over time. But even if we're accurately measuring total production, which there are some problems with, it doesn't reflect other things. So there's the value of leisure, how much time people actually enjoy, like on their own, that's not producing any value for anyone. Doesn't count things like pollution or other negative effects of production. Doesn't focus on crime or other social problems. And it doesn't worry about the distribution of income. So improvements in many of these may result in lower GDP per capita. The example they give is crime. So if there's less crime in a community, you'll end up with lower spending on police because you don't need as many police officers. You don't need as many corrections officers in the jail, smaller jails, fewer police cruisers. All this reduces government spending, so it reduces GDP. And private security too. But obviously we want to live in a community that has less crime rather than more crime. So this is a reduction in GDP that actually improves people's lives. Another example is the value of leisure. So things like enjoying time with your family, going for a walk in the park, these aren't counted because there's no payment being involved here. And it also doesn't take into account the value of leisure on someone's life. So even though they're sacrificing GDP by not working and by having fun, they're enjoying life. So that's still an important thing that's not being captured by this measure. Since about 1900, the average hours worked has fallen by about 20 hours. So we dropped from about 60 hours per week to about 40 hours per week. So if we kept up our great-grandparents' hard work, like hard work ethic, we'd have a much higher GDP today if we all worked those 60 hours. But we'd be working 6-7 days a week, or maybe probably 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Or maybe we're doing like normal hours 7 days a week. It's not very fun. We're not able to enjoy ourselves. As Alfred Lord Tennyson said, as though to breathe were life. that there's more than just working and producing these things. So without being able to take time with family and friends, we'd have a higher GDP, but we'd have a worse overall life. And then there's no way for us to price pollution into GDP. Obviously, pollution ends up being bad, has a negative impact on people. I didn't write down there. When we banned lead in gasoline in the United States, the best research on like why crime rates dropped precipitously about 1990 was the banning of lead in gasoline. Lead's known to cause damage to the brain in the areas that reduce IQ, and it reduces like impulse control. People with lower IQs and lower impulse controls are much more likely to engage in violent crime. And since we banned it, we've seen a sharp drop. That's contrary to some other findings of Donahue and Leavitt found it was legalization of abortion was associated with lower crime rates. Another researcher found it was the reinstitution of the death penalty, but there's problems with all those theories. The lead in the gasoline, lower lead exposure, seems to be the best one we have right now. So we have reducing pollution may actually have, in this case, decreased GDP. Okay, this kind of brings up an idea of the broken window fallacy. Going back to like the crime example, where we're making our communities better, so but that decreases our amount of spending. So this is something important, so I wanted to focus on this. It's not in the chapter, but I thought it was close enough related. So what happens when we break a window? Window has to get fixed. So we're going to spend money on fixing the window, right? So more employment in the window industry, more spending, so we have higher GDP, right? But that's not the whole story. So we're missing on the opportunity cost. So instead of buying a new window, we could have spent that money on something else more enjoyable. We could have spent it on, say, a book, if anyone even reads anymore. Then we'd have been in the same place we were before, window-wise, but now we have a book in addition. So we have something else. So we end up spending more money to get us back to the place that we were before. So this makes us worse off. It doesn't make us better off. If that was true, that is destroying something and rebuilding it, improve GDP, we could bulldoze every city every year and have sky-high GDP. But we never make ourselves better off. And remember, that's what GDP is trying to get at, is our quality of life. Here's a few really good economists that have fallen into the trap. So the first is former New York Fed President William Dudley. This is an extremely prestigious position, and only top-notch economists can get to this position. But he was talking about one of the hurricanes a few years ago, and he said obviously the cost of human life are going to be very harmful, but those effects tend to be pretty transitory, and in the long run, it lifts economic activity because you have to rebuild all the things that have been damaged. Again, that's just getting us back to where we were before, but we're spending extra money to get there. And Paul Krugman, who before he was a New York Times columnist, was a Nobel laureate for his work on international trade. After 9/11, he noted that Manhattan would need some new office buildings. We need a lot of improvements around the whole World Trade Center area. So rebuilding is going to generate at least some increase in business spending. Again, it's going to increase business spending, but it's going to get us back where we were before. So GDP is going to increase, but our lives are not any better off. Every time I see an economist write about the broken window fallacy, that's my reaction. And the broken window fallacy dates back to Friedrich Bastiat, who was a French economist in like the 1850s, who pointed that out from economists in his time. guys have any questions about how well GDP measures human well-being, the problems with its accuracy, things like that? Besides, how the hell does BEA actually do it? I'll write a note so I can. One of my bosses when I was in DC used to work for BEA before we worked together, and he was involved in some of the calculations. But it wasn't like the nitty-gritty actually getting the numbers. Something tells me it's going to be very depressing how arbitrary it is. Okay, so let's look at the next section, real GDP versus nominal GDP. So when we see GDP increase from one year to the next, we have to ask ourselves, is the increase in GDP due to production increasing? So are we producing more goods and more services, making ourselves better off? Or is it due to prices increasing, which makes people worse off because they're able to afford less with the same salary? So an increase in GDP could be good or it could be bad depending on what's causing it. So in order to get at this, to figure out which one is going on, the BEA produces both nominal GDP. So it's just the value of goods and services at current year prices. So it's the price of those goods times the quantity, summed across all the goods in the economy. And then there's real GDP. So the value of the final goods and services that are evaluated at a certain base year's prices. So the current standard is 2009. They take the prices in 2009 and the current number being sold. So that way you don't get the inflation getting in the way. You know exactly how much better off we're getting, as well as GDP can measure that. Yeah, like I mentioned, the base year is pretty arbitrary. It doesn't matter what we choose. Right now it's 2009. In a couple years, we'll increase it. We just do that over time. There's also problems with relative prices of goods. The prices of goods compared to each other, not just compared to themselves over time. They're going to change from year to year, so it'll make GDP calculations across time a little more difficult. So the BEA does something called chain-weighted prices. They use previous year prices to adjust current year production. That's not something you really need to worry about, just know that it's a little bit more accurate now. So we'll do a quick example of calculating real GDP just so you can get a better picture of what's going on here. So right here we have production in 2009 and in 2017. So we look at the total value of output in 2009 for these three different products. We're pretending the whole economy is eye exams, pizzas, and shoes. This is kind of unrealistic. So basically, if we want to get the total value of this GDP for this very simple economy in 2009, we take the 80 eye exams times $40, 90 pizzas times $11, and 15 shoes times $90. And then we literally just sum the three of those, and we get our GDP of 5,540. We're going to use the year 2009 as a base, so that's our real and our nominal GDP. So if we want to calculate real GDP in 2017, we take the quantity in 2017, and we multiply it by the price in 2009. So we're using those old 2009 prices, so there's no inflation that's going on. So we take 100 times 40, 80 times 11, and 20 times 90, and then add those three together. You get 6,680. That's our real GDP. And we see from 09 to 17 for eye exams, the price went up by $10. The price of pizzas fell by $1. And the price of shoes went up by $10. So we see some inflation and a little bit of deflation in pizzas. So if we took the nominal GDP of 2017, so the 2017 price and the 2017 quantity, we end up with $7,800. So because of these change in prices, we're overstating how much the economy grew. So if you're trying to compare apples to apples, trying to understand how much more productive the economy is over time, we need to use those $2,009 again. So we can capture, the essence of the real growth rate over that time. So we look at GDP and real GDP over time. This is from 1990 to 2015. So if we're setting the base year at 2009, represented by this vertical line right here, real GDP and nominal GDP are the same. We're using 2009 prices for both. Because there's positive inflation over this entire time period, nominal GDP is lower in the past, before that base year, and nominal is going to be higher after the base year. That's just due to the existence of positive inflation. Normally when the media talks about GDP, they're talking about real GDP. So they're taking into account inflation. So that's the one that the BEA highlights the most. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else I want to say about this. Oftentimes, economists and policymakers alike are going to be interested in the price level. So the average prices of goods and services across the economy. Helps give us an understanding of how much more difficult or how much easier it is for consumers to actually buy the goods and services they typically buy. Stable prices are good because they allow households and firms to plan for the future. It's much easier when you know what the price is going to be and when the price is going to be the same. Makes the math much simpler. Even if you had stable inflation, the higher the inflation rate is, the more difficult it would be for firms and for individuals to plan for the future. The Fed currently targets an inflation rate of 2%. Their goal is to keep inflation right at 2%. So we have this low but stable inflation rate. It would be even easier for consumers if the inflation rate was 0, just because prices are staying the same in general. So it makes it much more easy to plan. We'll talk about this later when we get to inflation, about why the Fed wants to do that. Keep it at 2% rather than 0. But in order to know whether we're actually achieving this price stability, if we're hitting what we want to hit, we need to measure the price level somehow. And there's several different ways to do that. We'll talk about other ways, what I think are better ways, what economists use more frequently later on. But one way to do it is using what's called the GDP deflator. This is a simple way. They just measure the price level by dividing nominal GDP by real GDP and multiplying by 100. And this gives you the inflation rate across the entire economy. So real quickly, the formula, inflator is equal to nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. So if we take 2013, nominal GDP divided by real GDP right here, multiplied by 100, gives us 106.7. It should be above 100 because remember 2009 is our year where GDP and real GDP are the same. It's our base year. So 2009 is going to be 100. Anything past there because of positive inflation is going to be above that. We look at 2014, take nominal GDP divided by the real GDP, and we multiply that by 100, we get 108. So if we wanted to think of what's the rate of change, what's the increase in the price level over this period, we can take the simple change formula, the second period, minus the old, the first period, divided by the first period, multiplied by 100. So that'll give us 1.5%. I'm not going to have you calculate this on the exam or anything. It's just to show you where these numbers are coming from. So by calculating the GDP deflator in each year and then finding the rate of change, we can say what the percentage change in the price level was over that time. So that's like our inflation rate. So turning to an example of Nigeria, when their GDP doubled overnight. because they underfunded their government data collection, they really didn't care about it. Nigeria was working with old data. They weren't able to accurately estimate their GDP. So they were still using 1990 as its base year, even though there were a large change in prices and a lot of new products and a lot of better products over that time, which they were just completely ignoring because they didn't have the people there working able to do it, and they didn't have the money to pay anyone to do it. And it was underestimating the extent of the service sector, which had been growing over that time. Because as economies, as they grow, they tend to have larger and larger service sectors. So when they were finally able to update their data, what they were working with, the 2013 real GDP jumped from 270 billion to 510 billion. This wasn't because of any increase in living standards, it's because they were just using more accurate data. The BEA tries to adjust every year or every couple years to keep GDP accurately reflecting the health of the economy. So this is just an extreme case of when they were not able to for 20 years, how inaccurate your GDP estimates can become. All right, and let's quickly go through other measures of total productivity. So the BA does a whole national income and products accounts table, does all these different measures. So they breaks down GDP into the things we saw earlier, different components, the consumer spending, investment, government spending, and then exports, and then all the subcategories under there. But it also provides gross national product. This was what we used to represent total output in the economy before we used GDP. So this is from like the 40s into like, I think the early 60s. This was our main focus. And basically it's just production performed by citizens of a nation. So before we subtracted out imports and we added in exports and subtracted imports. For gross national product, we're looking at a slightly different thing. The C, the I, the G are all the same. But now this is production performed by the US. So if we're producing something overseas, if Ford has a plant overseas, we're counting this in the GNP. And if Toyota has a manufacturing plant in the US, we're not counting that in GNP. It's basically what people in the country own, no matter where it's being produced, is GNP. The next is national income. So it's GDP minus the consumption of fixed capital, which is basically just depreciation. As you use a good over time, the more you use it, you get wear and tear on it, its value goes down. That decrease in value is called depreciation. Then they have a measure of personal income, so income received by households. It includes transfer payments, so like GDP did not include Social Security, like welfare programs, things like that. This is being counted in personal income because it's money people are receiving. But we're excluding firms' retained earnings, which means the profits that are given to the owners of the company. And finally, they measure disposable personal income. So personal income minus tax payments, basically all the money people have that they're willing and able to spend on goods and services. GDP is the big one that economists worry about, so that's why it's the focus of this chapter. And I just kind of highlighted these as other things that exist. Here you can see how these compare to each other. So GDP is going to be the highest. Oh no, sorry, GNP is the highest because of how much foreign production the US has. GDP is slightly behind that. And then we see national income's a little bit lower, personal income a little bit lower, and disposable personal income a little lower than that. Yeah. And just disposable personal income is personal income minus taxes, so it's going to be lower. National income is less than GDP because it's GDP minus depreciation. As you can see, even in 2014, these are all quite large numbers. Although GDP and GNP are up over 20 trillion at this point. We'll quickly turn to the output gap, which wasn't mentioned in this chapter, but I think it's worth mentioning because it's something the Federal Reserve talks about all the time. No one really talks about GNP or disposable personal income when they're trying to make policy decisions, but the output gap is something that's referenced. So the output gap is it's a measure of the difference between the actual output in the economy, so what's the real GDP currently, and its potential output. So what is our potential GDP if we're operating efficiently? Now, potential output isn't what we could do with all the resources we have. Say we're working overtime, everyone's working constantly. It's the maximum amount of goods and services an economy can turn out when it's operating at its full normal capacity. So firms are using all their resources without having to do things like expand employment, expand the hours worked of their employees past typical full-time. They're not buying new capital. It's just how much can you naturally make if you're using everything you have. So you can have a positive or a negative output gap depending on how the economy's performing, how high your GDP is. So you have a positive output gap when the actual output is more than full capacity. So if you have people working overtime, if you're buying additional capital while everyone else is at full capacity, then you get a positive output gap. And you have a negative output gap, which is more common. So that's when the actual output, the real GDP, is below what the economy could produce if it was operating at full capacity. Typically, the economy doesn't operate at full capacity. So here's the output gap over time. That black line there is 0. So you can see previous to the 2001 recession, we had an output gap of about 2.5. We got up above our potential GDP. We were using even more resources. We had firms hiring more people, buying additional capital to increase their production. And we see most times it's below 0, so the negative output gap. Policymakers want the economy to be close to the output gap. So either slightly below or slightly above. If it gets too high above, they get worried about the economy, what they call overheating. They're worried inflation is going to take off in the near future. It's a sign of problems on the horizon. Likewise, if it's too low, like they had an output gap of -5% in the 2008 recession, that was a serious worry for economists because we could be producing a lot more goods and services, but we're not. So it's highlighting a weakness in something we'll talk about later, aggregate demand. Consumers aren't buying as much as they normally would. In this case, there are a lot of unemployed workers. Unemployed workers are going to buy less. We had a lot of consumers that weren't confident in the economy. So we talked about durable goods earlier. Durable goods orders were down as well. And that's the end of the chapter, which is perfect timing. It's the end of the class. So Monday, we're going to talk about, start of the next chapter is inflation, I think. So we'll start with inflation. Wednesday, we'll finish that up and then do a review at the end of class. And then next Friday is going to be your exam.